Just after sunrise on September 12, 2020, on the Shantar Islands, a chain of wild, forested lands in the far reaches of the Russian Far East. A light mist rolled off the sea, softening the outlines of spruce trees and dampening every sound. Nearby, a fisherman named Oleg, 48, seasoned and solitary, had woken early to check his tide nets, anchored in the shallows of the rocky cove. His small camp was tucked beneath the trees, far enough from the sea winds, but close enough to smell the salt. He had noticed the family 2 days prior. A Russian couple in their late 30s with 3 children, aged 4 to 10. They had arrived by boat, waving politely, and set up their green tent about 50 meters inland, sheltered between birch trunks. They had the look of people chasing a peaceful escape. Neatly packed gear, warm coats, and quiet laughter that drifted across the shore. Oleg thought little of them after that. The Shantars were remote but not deserted, and he respected other people's solitude. That morning, as he moved toward the water, he noticed a large shape lumbering at the tree line. He froze, instinct taking over. At first, it looked like a trick of the fog, a brown blur between trunks. Then it stepped clear into view. It was massive. A full-grown grizzly, easily 900 pounds, its coat thick with dirt, its shoulders hunched like boulders beneath its matted fur. The bear was starved, bones visible beneath the hide, eyes sunken, movements desperate. It sniffed the air, lifted its head toward the trees, then turned slowly toward the clearing where the family's tent stood. Oleg's breath caught. He crouched instinctively, ducking behind a driftwood log, his heart beginning to hammer. The bear walked with eerie calm, silent, except for the dull crackle of dry leaves beneath its paws. It was heading straight for the tent, low and steady, as if it already knew where to go. Oleg wanted to shout, to run forward, to make noise, but he didn't move. Something primal pinned him in place, something colder than fear, the realization that he was watching something inevitable. The bear closed the last 10 meters in seconds, then surged forward. Its body slammed into the side of the tent like a truck, the fabric collapsing instantly under its weight. There was no time for anyone inside to react. The canvas exploded outward as claws tore through it, flinging pieces of gear and fabric into the clearing. The man inside, broad-shouldered, still groggy with sleep, was the first to be hit. Oleg saw his arm come up instinctively, trying to block, but the bear's paw knocked him back like a rag doll. The crack of bone echoed across the trees. The man rolled once, then went still. The bear didn't pause. It lunged at the center of the tent again, jaws snapping as the mother shrieked, her body flung sideways in a blur of motion and hair. She scrambled toward the children, but the bear knocked her flat with a single swipe, her head striking a rock with a sickening sound that ended her screams. One child, maybe the eldest, a boy, bolted through a tear in the tent, barefoot, legs pumping. He made it only a few steps before the bear spun, faster than seemed possible, and caught him with a lunge. Its jaws clamped down on the boy's back and dragged him violently across the ground, lifting him partially off the dirt before tossing him aside like meat too small to satisfy. The other 2 children huddled in the far corner of the tent, clinging to each other. Oleg saw them for a second, 2 tiny forms tangled in sleeping bags, eyes wide with terror. The bear turned back toward them. There was no hesitation in its movement, no mercy in its gaze. It lunged once more into the wreckage of the tent, its paws thundering into the earth, claws ripping. One child was struck instantly, the body thrown against the tree trunk. The other, a little girl, managed to crawl a few feet before the bear crushed her beneath its weight. It was over as quickly as it began. 4 minutes, maybe less. Silence fell again, thick and unnatural. The bear stood in the ruins of the tent, sides heaving, blood staining its snout and chest. Oleg hadn't moved. His legs were numb, his stomach twisted into knots. He could smell the copper in the air from where he crouched. He had seen death before, hunting, fishing, accidents at sea, but never like this. Never this fast, never this final. The bear sniffed the ground, then lifted its head and looked toward the trees. For one horrifying second, Oleg thought it had seen him. But the bear turned and walked back the way it had come, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had arrived. Only when it was gone did Oleg rise, his legs trembling under his weight. He stumbled forward, not sure what he could do. There was nothing left to save. The campsite was torn to shreds. Blood was everywhere, in the grass, on the trees, soaked into clothing and sleeping bags. The silence was broken only by the soft flap of torn fabric in the breeze. When he finally radioed for help, his voice shook. Hours later, when rescue crews arrived by boat, they found him still kneeling near the edge of the clearing, pale and trembling, his hands stained red. The bodies were recovered, each marked by violent trauma, their positions a chilling map of the bear's merciless path. The investigation confirmed what Oleg had said. No food was left out, no mistakes were made. The family had followed every safety rule. It hadn't mattered. The bear had been starving. Desperation had overridden fear. It had hunted like a predator, not scavenged like a forager. It had come for blood, not scraps. In the days that followed, Oleg didn't sleep much. He stayed in his cabin, doors locked, rifle loaded. He kept seeing the moment the bear crashed through the tent, kept hearing the crack of bone and the sudden quiet. On the Shantar Islands, nature didn't ask permission, and when it struck, it gave no warnings. April 11th, 2019, in a national park in northwestern Montana, where alpine meadows slip into dark pine forests and spring snow lingers in the shade, Dana Walsh moved through the trees alone. She was 32, a certified wilderness first responder with years of backcountry rescue under her belt. The solo exercise was a test, 72 hours with minimal gear, no outside contact, designed to simulate disconnection and the stress of survival. She carried just the basics: a tarp, water filter, small ration kit, medical pouch, and bear spray clipped to her hip. The instructors would monitor from afar, but she would see no one. On the second morning, light broke gently across the ridgelines, melting patches of snow into the soil. Dana had made camp by a narrow stream, packed up early, and was moving uphill into denser forest. The trees grew tighter as she climbed, branches wet with dew, boots crunching softly through old needles. She felt strong, focused, and tuned into every sound. But something shifted mid-morning. She paused near a cluster of boulders, wiping her brow, and noticed a print in the melting snow beside her boot. It was deep, wide, and the claw marks were visible even in the slush. A grizzly, not more than a few hours old. Her stomach tightened. Just beyond the rocks, she spotted a pile of scat, loose, packed with berries, steam still faintly rising. Too fresh. She straightened, her hand drifting instinctively toward her bear spray. Then the branches broke. The sound was sudden, violent. A blur of motion exploded from the trees uphill. The bear was massive, with matted brown fur, shoulders high and round like boulders. It moved with speed that didn't match its size, crashing through brush straight for her. Dana reached for the spray, but the clip stuck for a heartbeat too long. She ran, or tried to. Her foot caught loose shale at the edge of a slope, and her body twisted mid-step. She went down hard, sliding through gravel and broken rock, landing chest first on a flat slab below. Pain fired through her ribs. She gasped, trying to move, her pack cushioning a little. The wind had been knocked out of her, and her vision blurred. Above her, the bear paused. It stood at the top of the slope, watching her. Its breath came in heavy huffs, misting into the cold morning air. Then it descended, not in a rush, not with teeth bared, but slow and deliberate, each step placed with eerie control. Gravel shifted beneath its weight as it came closer, filling her ears with crunching dread. Dana didn't move. She couldn't. Her ribs throbbed, and her lungs fluttered like they didn't know what to do. Her right arm had gone numb. The bear reached her in seconds and towered over her, close enough that she could hear the thick pull of its breathing, see the twitch of its nostrils as it sniffed the air around her face. Then it pressed one massive paw against her chest. The pressure was heavy, almost crushing, but not sharp. Claws didn't dig in. The paw just held there for a second or two, testing the weight, testing resistance, as if deciding whether this was prey, threat, or something else. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her entire body locked down. And then the bear lifted its paw, turned, and walked away. Slowly, without a sound of struggle or aggression, it vanished into the trees above, its back swaying slightly with each stride. Within moments, it was gone, swallowed by the forest. Dana stayed down. She didn't try to move for what felt like hours. Time distorted around the pain in her chest and the ghost of pressure that remained. The sun pushed through the branches, shadows shifting across her face. Her breathing remained shallow and labored. At one point, she tried to sit up and nearly blacked out from the ache that shot through her ribs. She waited until dusk. Only then did she crawl, inch by inch, back toward the lower slope, finally making camp in a hollow between rocks. She wrapped her ribs with strips of spare clothing, swallowed water with shaking hands, and spent the night beneath her tarp, listening to every snap of twig and brush of wind. She finished the exercise. The following day, she arrived at the pickup zone on time. When the instructors asked how it went, she said little. She passed the physical with bruised ribs and hidden pain, never revealing what had happened. There were no bite marks, no photos, no injury that screamed trauma. Just faint paw-shaped bruising and the silence of someone who had been very close to the edge and walked away. Years passed. Dana continued working on the rescue. She became a trainer, teaching others how to move through wild places with respect, caution, and control. People often asked about her toughest call. She never mentioned the national park, never talked about the bear. But the memory remained, not as a nightmare of claws or growls or blood, but of stillness, of the moment when breath became the only thing left between her and death. The bear hadn't been enraged. It hadn't lashed out blindly. It had looked at her and tested. That touch, light for its strength, had been enough to communicate what words never could. And sometimes in the quiet between calls, she would remember that weight, not as a trauma, but as a presence. The feeling of the forest holding its breath, of something ancient deciding her fate without violence. It was the not knowing, not whether she would live or die, but when, and whether it would be her breath that stayed or stopped. That uncertainty never left her. It lived quietly inside her, tucked into the hollow between her ribs, still breathing. October 3rd, 2008, in the high reaches of the Caucasus Mountains, where fog clings low and the air thins with every step, Anton Vlasov moved deeper into the limestone ridges alone. At 39, he had spent half his life in caves, surveying, mapping, and chasing the call of underground silence. A seasoned spelunker and geologist, he had come to this part of the range on a solo expedition, hoping to chart the rumored dead-end side chambers of a narrow cave system known locally as Kavri's Throat. Few dared go far into it. Locals said it was a cold, cramped vein in the mountain that led nowhere. Anton didn't believe in anything. By the third day, he was more than 100 meters below the surface, with only a helmet lamp, climbing gear, and a small pack of essentials. The air was still, the cold sharpening as he entered a passage he hadn't explored on previous trips. Its ceiling dipped lower with every meter, forcing him to crouch, then crawl, his hands numb through gloves as he pulled himself forward. He moved slowly, marking walls with chalk, his breath visible in the light. Then, in the dark ahead, something exhaled. It was not the wind. There was no draft, not air from a fissure or a settling echo. It was low, deep, and wet, a single breath. Anton froze, every muscle stiffening as instinct smothered thought. He held still in the silence that followed, heart pounding in his chest. Then his lamp caught the shape at the back of the narrow chamber, a bulk of dark fur curled tight against the wall, chest rising slowly and heavily. A brown bear, its form almost indistinguishable from the surrounding rock. It was asleep, or nearly so. Its breathing slow but uneven, one ear twitching, eyes not fully closed. Anton felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on him. There was no room to stand, no space to turn and sprint. Just a narrow body length of ground between him and the chamber's only exit. He began to crawl backward, inch by inch, every movement deliberate. His body trembled with the effort to remain silent, to shift his weight without disturbing the gravel or brushing against the walls. But the cave floor betrayed him. His boot slid against a patch of loose stone, and the sound was small, but it was enough. The bear stirred. Its breathing stopped for a heartbeat. Then it uncurled, head lifting. Eyes opened, dark and blank, locking onto the human shape caught in its cave. It didn't roar. It didn't hesitate. It surged forward in a single, violent lunge. Anton shoved himself backward into a narrow gap in the wall, barely the width of his shoulders. The rock scraped skin through his jacket. He twisted, wedging himself sideways as the bear slammed toward him. Its claws struck his thigh, tearing through muscle and fabric in one clean swipe. The pain exploded down his leg like fire, hot and nauseating. Blood poured immediately, soaking into the stone. The bear pressed against the crack, its snout inches from Anton's chest, breath steaming in the cold. It growled once, low and close, a rumble that vibrated through the stone, but then it stopped. After a long pause, it backed away into the chamber, disappearing from the light as slowly as it had come. Anton didn't move. He remained wedged in the crevice for hours, shaking, teeth chattering from cold and shock. Blood continued to seep from the wound on his leg, the warmth of it mixing with the cave's damp chill. Every few minutes he imagined the bear returning, saw its outline in the dark, and heard the breath again. But it never came back. 6 hours passed in near-complete stillness. At one point he tried to shift, but pain lanced through his body, nearly making him black out. He pressed his hand against the torn thigh to slow the bleeding, and focused only on breathing. His water was gone. His headlamp began to flicker. When he could no longer stand the cold or the silence, he forced himself to move. Crawling on one knee and one elbow, he inched back through the tunnel, dragging his shredded leg behind him. It was a slow, grueling escape. At times, the pain made his vision swim. At other times, he hallucinated movement behind him, convinced the bear was following, that it had waited and then changed its mind. By the time he reached the main passage, he had lost nearly all feeling in his foot. His leg looked mauled, deep claw marks running from hip to knee, muscle exposed in jagged lines. He climbed the last stretch to daylight with arms alone, crawling like an animal across stone slick with condensation. Outside the cave, the mountain air stung his skin, brighter and sharper than anything underground. He had no signal, no help. But he knew the terrain well enough to drag himself down the ridge, through brush and mud, until a shepherd's dog found him near the edge of a meadow. He was taken by horseback to a village clinic, then airlifted to a hospital. The surgeons saved the leg, though the nerves would never fully recover. He walked with a limp, long scars wrapped around his thigh like red vines. But he recovered. What haunted him wasn't the moment of the strike. It wasn't even the pain or the image of the bear's claws disappearing into his skin. It was the breath, that first low exhale from the dark, the silence afterward. Not the peace of untouched wilderness, but the heavy, waiting kind. The kind that meant something was already awake and aware, watching without fear, and choosing, for now, not to finish what it had started. He never returned to that cave. He never finished mapping the chamber. Some places, he would later say, aren't dead ends at all. They're warnings. August 14th, 2015 began with the sky already hazy over Alberta's thick forests, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and burning pine. Carlos, a seasoned wildfire firefighter with over a decade of fieldwork, had been part of countless dangerous operations before, but this one carried a different weight. The blaze had spread quickly overnight, forcing his crew to push deep toward the fire's edge to cut away dense brush and create a break that could slow the advancing flames. He was known among his peers for his sharp instincts, calm demeanor under pressure, and unmatched stamina during long shifts. Raised in a small rural town near the Rockies, Carlos had grown up hunting, fishing, and learning how to read the forest signs from his grandfather. That upbringing gave him a respect for wildlife, but also an understanding that wild animals could act unpredictably under stress, especially in disasters. The sun was barely visible through the thick orange haze when Carlos moved to a section of overgrown underbrush separated from the main crew. The ground was uneven, the heat pressing down in waves, and the distant roar of the fire grew louder as wind carried it toward them. His hands worked quickly, swinging his Pulaski tool to clear low branches and tangled shrubs, each strike blending into the rhythmic noise of nearby chainsaws and crackling flames. Despite the chaos, he remained focused, his eyes scanning both the terrain and the shifting wall of smoke ahead. Then, in an instant, the forest's sounds changed. The normal distant noise of fire and falling trees gave way to a deep, guttural rumble that froze him mid-step. Through the shifting smoke, a massive shape emerged, dark, broad, and moving with a deliberate force. A large female grizzly stepped into view, her coat thick with dust and ash, her head lowered toward him. Two cubs trailed behind her, their small bodies tense as they stayed close to her side. Before Carlos could retreat, the bear's posture shifted. Her ears flattened, her front paw struck the ground, and with a surge of raw power, she lunged forward. Carlos dropped his tool instantly, heart pounding, and turned toward the nearest escape, a steep embankment that led to higher ground. The rough slope was scattered with loose dirt and protruding roots, each step a battle against slipping back down. Halfway up, his boot caught against a buried branch, sending him tumbling forward. Sharp rocks tore into his arm, leaving streaks of blood down his sleeve. He scrambled upright and pushed forward again, only to stumble a second time, his legs straining to keep pace ahead of the thundering movement behind him. The bear closed the gap quickly, her growls cutting through the smoke and ash-filled air. Carlos reached for the one lifeline still within his grasp, the air horn clipped to his belt. Without hesitation, he turned, raising it toward the massive figure now just a few strides away. His finger tightened on the trigger, unleashing a deafening blast that pierced the chaos of the fire and the pounding of his own heartbeat. The blaring horn shattered the tense air, echoing sharply across the smoky hillside. The grizzly flinched, halting mid-stride, her head lifting slightly as the piercing sound cut through her instinct to attack. For a moment, Carlos could see the wild confusion in her eyes, torn between protecting her cubs and retreating from the sudden noise. Ash swirled around them as the fire's heat pulsed in steady waves, and the ground trembled faintly from distant collapsing trees. The bear's hesitation gave Carlos the precious seconds he needed. He took a step backward, keeping his body turned toward her so she could see him moving away without triggering another charge. The cubs shifted nervously behind her, and with one final huff, she lowered her head, pivoted toward the thicker brush, and melted back into the forest shadows. Carlos stood frozen for a heartbeat, chest heaving, before finally forcing his legs to move. His arms and legs burned from scrapes, and sweat mingled with the smoke on his skin. The embankment ahead looked endless, but he climbed steadily, driven by the need to regroup with his team. Every rustle in the brush sent his pulse racing, but the only sounds now were the distant pop of burning timber and the crackle of dry branches underfoot. When he finally reached a small ridge, the faint outlines of his crew came into view through the smoky veil. Relief swept through him like a cold wind after a long climb. The others noticed his battered state immediately. Though shaken, Carlos quickly signaled for them to keep working while he caught his breath. They had a fire line to maintain, and every minute counted. Still, word of his encounter spread fast among the firefighters. The knowledge that a grizzly and her cubs were now roaming close to the active fire zone added another layer of risk to an already dangerous job. Throughout the afternoon, Carlos remained close to the central crew, helping direct brush clearing and keeping an ear tuned for any unusual sounds. The adrenaline from the encounter slowly faded, replaced by a deep fatigue that made his hands tremble when he stopped moving. His cuts stung each time sweat trickled over them, but he ignored the discomfort, focusing on the task ahead. By evening, the fire's spread had slowed in their section, thanks to the combined efforts of the teams. When helicopters finally arrived with water drops, Carlos felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly. As they retreated from the active line for the night, the image of the bear's sudden appearance replayed in his mind. He knew the wildfire had likely driven her into unfamiliar territory, making her more defensive and unpredictable. Back at the temporary camp, medics cleaned and dressed his wounds, noting how lucky he was to have avoided worse injuries. Around the firebreak that night, the crew spoke quietly about the day's events. The story of his narrow escape served as a sober reminder that in the wild, danger can come from more than just flames. The next morning, Carlos was back on the line, fully aware that the forest and its inhabitants were watching every move. On August 3, 2009, thick smoke rolled across the wild hills of Alberta as flames crept closer to the dense forest. Carlos, a seasoned firefighter with more than a decade of experience, was working near the fire's edge. Over the years, he had faced everything from small grass fires to massive blazes, earning a reputation among his crew for endurance and quick thinking. Growing up in a rural community surrounded by forest, he'd learned early how unpredictable nature could be. This wildfire had already consumed hundreds of acres, and that day's assignment placed him in a high-risk zone, cutting back heavy brush to slow the flames' advance. The heat was relentless, pressing against him like a physical weight, and the air carried the acrid sting of burning wood. Ash drifted down like snow, clinging to his gear and settling into the folds of his gloves. The constant roar of the flames was a deep, steady backdrop as he worked. His boots sank into uneven ground, and each swing of his tool sent leaves and twigs scattering. Visibility was poor. Smoke drifted thick between tree trunks, and the dense undergrowth made every step deliberate. Still, Carlos moved steadily, knowing every section cleared could help slow the fire's spread before a sudden shift in wind. Then, something in the haze moved. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker in the shifting smoke. But as the wind pushed the haze aside, the shape resolved into a massive grizzly not 20 feet away. Her head was low, her muscles tense, and two small cubs clung close to her side, their pale fur stark against the scorched earth. The mother's dark eyes locked on him, and her body lowered further in a silent warning. Carlos realized instantly what had happened. He had stumbled into her path, and with the fire closing in, she had no escape. The deep rumble of her growl cut through the sound of burning trees, low and threatening. In the next heartbeat, she lunged, the ground trembling under her charge. Adrenaline surged. He dropped his tool and turned toward the steep slope ahead. The embankment was littered with loose soil and sharp rocks, but it was the only chance to put distance between them. Boots digging in, he sprinted downhill, heart hammering in his chest. Halfway down, his foot caught on a root buried under ash. He pitched forward, hitting hard on his side. Pain flared along his forearm where skin tore against jagged stone. He scrambled up, but the slope was treacherous. A tangle of branches caught his boot, sending him stumbling again. Scratches burned along his legs and arms, mixing with the heat already pressing in on him. The sound of pursuit didn't falter. Heavy paws crushed debris, and her sharp, quick breaths grew louder. Smoke curled between them, but Carlos could still glimpse her moving through the haze, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Pushing past exhaustion, he forced himself onward. The slope leveled into a small clearing, the ground here flat but cluttered with fallen logs and loose debris. He steadied himself enough to grab the one thing still at his belt, his air horn. As the bear closed the final stretch, Carlos swung the device up and pressed it hard. A burst of piercing sound exploded into the air, cutting through the roar of the fire and the thick blanket of smoke. The sudden, unnatural noise made her stop short, head jerking back as her ears flattened. For a moment, they stared at each other through the shifting haze, her breathing deep and deliberate. Carlos hit the horn again, longer, louder. She blinked, took a slow step back, and her cubs pressed tight against her legs. With a final growl, she turned toward the darker edge of the forest, leading the cubs away from the flames. Only when she disappeared from sight did Carlos lower the horn. His arms trembled from both adrenaline and exertion, his chest heaving in sharp bursts. Blood trickled from his forearm into his glove, and his uniform was scuffed, carrying the mixed scent of smoke, sweat, and torn earth. He bent to retrieve his dropped tools and began the climb back towards safer ground where the rest of his crew worked. The wildfire's edge was closer now, orange light flickering through thick smoke as embers rained down in short bursts. Other firefighters turned to look as he approached, eyes catching on his torn gear and bleeding arm. No one needed to ask what had happened. Command was alerted immediately. Nearby crews were pulled back from that sector to avoid more encounters with wildlife displaced by the fire. Wildlife officers along the perimeter were warned, ready to deal with animals moving unpredictably in the shifting chaos. Carlos received treatment on the line. Cool water rinsed away grit from his scrapes before fresh bandages were wrapped around his arm. The medic worked quickly, but Carlos knew the marks from the rough ground would stay for weeks. Even as his wounds were cleaned, the scene replayed in his head. The bear's sudden lunge, the closeness of her breath, the raw force of her presence. By nightfall, the fire still burned, the smell of charred wood heavy in the air. The crew gathered for a briefing, and word of Carlos's encounter passed through camp in low tones. Some nodded grimly, knowing wildfires often drove animals into sudden, dangerous contact with people. Others glanced toward the dark tree line, reminded that the balance between human and wild could shift without warning. For Carlos, the day's events settled into memory, a sharp reminder that survival in these places depended on readiness, instinct, and a deep respect for the forces, both flame and flesh, that shape the wilderness. On June 4th, 2022, the road cut through endless forest like a scar, narrow, uneven, winding deep into the eastern Siberian wilderness. Frost clung to the edges of tree trunks even in early autumn, and the dirt path, churned by heavy equipment, was slick with mud and early ice. Ivan, 51, and his younger co-worker Grigory, 33, were headed back from a week-long timber job near the upper reaches of the Uda River. Their flatbed Ural truck was loaded lightly, but its rear axle had taken a hard hit on a boulder just an hour before. Now it groaned with every turn, the metal screeching against itself, barely holding. The forest around them was thick, shadowed even in daylight, and the truck's radio had gone dead that morning. No signal this deep, not for miles. Their progress was slow. Branches scraped the windshield, and engine noise echoed hollowly through the trees. Around a bend in the road, just past a slope where runoff carved gullies into the clay, the truck's headlights picked up something in the center of the path. It was motionless at first. A shape hunched over a dark form in the road, fur matted, haunches flexing. A grizzly, massive, easily over 800 pounds, its coat thick and reddish-brown, streaked with black mud and old blood. The animal stood over the carcass of a half-eaten bull elk, ribs exposed and steaming in the cold air. One antler lay snapped beneath a foreleg. The bear glanced up slowly as the truck rolled to a stop 30 meters away, its dark eyes catching the low light. Ivan killed the engine. The ticking of hot metal cooling was the only sound for a few seconds. Grigory gripped the dash, unmoving. The bear didn't bolt. It didn't flinch. It simply stared, then returned to feeding, muscles rippling as it tore through sinew and flesh. They waited. Minutes passed. Nothing changed. The bear stayed in the middle of the road, unmoved by the presence of the truck. Its body blocked the path, and with the broken axle, reversing and taking the old logging detour would be nearly impossible. Ivan reached behind the seat and pulled out his hunting rifle. The bore was clean. The safety clicked off. Grigory opened his door quietly, stepping onto the gravel with his boots crunching faintly. Ivan followed, lifting the rifle to fire a warning shot into the air. He pulled the trigger. Nothing. A dull click echoed in the trees. The rifle had jammed. The bear lifted its head, eyes wide and fixed. A beat passed. Then it charged. The movement was sudden, brutally fast. The distance between them vanished in seconds. Ivan stepped back, slipped on the damp gravel, and hit the ground hard. The bear's paw swung wide, claws raking across his scalp, and the force of it slammed his head into the dirt. Pain shot through his jaw and down his neck, vision going white for a heartbeat as blood ran into his eyes. Grigory didn't think. He grabbed a wrench from the truck bed, a heavy steel one they used on axle bolts, and hurled it at the blur of muscle barreling into his friend. The tool struck the bear's side with a loud, wet thud. The animal spun, rearing onto its hind legs, teeth bared, chest rising like a wall in front of them. For a moment, time held still. Grigory stood frozen beside the truck, his hand still half raised. Ivan groaned on the ground, blood spreading beneath his head. The bear stayed upright, breathing hard, eyes locked on both men. But it didn't charge again. It dropped down onto all fours, backed slowly toward the elk, never turning its back. Then, with one final glance, it gripped the elk carcass in its jaws and dragged it off the road, bones scraping across rock and frozen ground. Silence followed. Neither man spoke. Ivan lay still, his hand pressed against his torn scalp, blood leaking between his fingers. His jaw ached badly, but he could move it. He blinked up at the canopy above, trying to focus. Grigory knelt beside him, eyes wide, hands trembling. No words passed between them, only breath, fogging into the cold air. They got Ivan to his feet, swaying, one arm over Grigory's shoulder. He stayed conscious, though blood dripped steadily down his neck and soaked into the collar of his coat. Back in the truck, Grigory drove, coaxing the vehicle forward despite the grinding protest of the broken axle. The metal screamed at every turn, but the wheels held. 4 hours they drove. Neither man spoke. The road was long, and the forest seemed darker than before, with branches that seemed denser, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The truck swayed and groaned and jerked across frost-heaved ruts, and all the while Ivan stared forward, hand pressed to his scalp, lips tight. When they finally reached a satellite tower and were able to radio for help, they were pale, drained, and numb. Ivan was flown to a hospital in Khabarovsk, where they stitched his scalp with 37 sutures and diagnosed him with a minor skull fracture and permanent hearing loss in one ear. The scar stretched across his scalp like a jagged line of lightning, always visible beneath his thinning hair. But the part he remembered most was not the pain, not the blood or the silence in his ear. It was the bear's eyes. He told Grigory later, when they met again weeks after, that what he saw wasn't fury. It wasn't madness or fear. It was certain. That bear hadn't hesitated. It had charged because it knew exactly what it was willing to do to protect what it had. The elk was its meal, the road was its ground, and the men were just pieces of motion that didn't matter. It had looked at them the way a predator looks at anything in its path, not with emotion, but with intent. And that was what stayed with them both. July 17th, 2025, began warm and bright in the rugged backcountry of Montana, where miles of twisting roads cut through endless forest and rolling hills. The Williams family had been on the road for several days, traveling in their luxury RV, a gleaming $300,000 machine. John, the father, had spent years saving for the vehicle, seeing it as both a family retreat and a way to explore the country's most remote landscapes. Beside him in the passenger seat was his wife, Linda, whose love for quiet scenery and wide skies had shaped many of their travel routes. In the back, their 2 children, Alex and Sophie, played a quiet game, the hum of the road a steady background. The RV, built for comfort but not for sudden, violent movement, carried them steadily deeper into the wilderness. The road that morning wound like a ribbon through dense stands of pine, their branches heavy with summer growth. Shadows shifted over the windshield as the vehicle climbed a gradual incline. The air inside was cool from the air conditioning, masking the heat pressing down outside. Wildlife sightings had been rare on this stretch, only the occasional deer far off in a meadow. The narrow pavement left little room on either side, with steep drop-offs in some areas and walls of brush in others. John kept a careful pace, mindful of the tight curves and limited visibility. Without warning, movement exploded from the greenery to their right. A grizzly bear of enormous size burst out of the brush less than 10 feet from the RV, its fur bristling and its mouth gaping in a roar that cut through the quiet. The ground seemed to shudder under its pounding stride as it charged toward the side of the moving vehicle. Its speed was terrifying, its bulk seeming to fill the world outside the windows in an instant. John's instincts reacted before thought could form. His foot slammed down on the brake pedal while his hands yanked the steering wheel sharply to the left, trying to avoid hitting the animal. The sudden maneuver was too much for the RV's top-heavy frame. The tires screamed against the asphalt before losing their grip entirely. Metal groaned and glass rattled as the vehicle tipped. In the next heartbeat, the RV rolled onto its side, sliding a short distance before coming to a shuddering stop. Inside, chaos erupted. The family was thrown against the walls and furniture, objects from cupboards and shelves raining down. The sharp sound of shattering glass mixed with the thuds of heavy items striking the floor. Through the side windows now facing the sky, the blur of green trees spun past, then stilled. The smell of fuel and dust filled the air. Linda braced herself against the nearest wall, her shoulder aching from the impact. The children's voices trembled as they tried to steady themselves, their eyes wide with shock. The roar from outside came again, closer this time, deep and resonant, vibrating through the frame of the RV. The bear had not retreated. Instead, it moved toward the tipped vehicle, claws clicking faintly against the road surface as it approached the metal shell that had landed in its path. The Grizzly moved with slow, deliberate steps, circling the fallen RV as if trying to understand the strange shape blocking the road. Its massive head turned side to side, nostrils flaring at the scent of people and spilled food from the cupboards. Deep scratches appeared along the metal as it dragged its claws across the side, the screech of tearing paint echoing through the narrow pass. Inside, the family stayed as still as possible, the air heavy with tension and the sharp smell of dust and gasoline. The vehicle's frame creaked under the shifting weight of the predator pressing against it. Emergency sirens in the distance broke the heavy quiet. Faint at first, they grew louder, carrying through the trees. The bear paused, its ears twitching toward the sound. For a moment, it stepped back, glancing toward the forest, but the lure of the overturned RV kept it close. Wildlife officers were the first to arrive, their truck skidding to a stop a short distance away. They moved quickly but carefully, pulling long canisters of bear spray and setting off loud, sharp bursts of sound that cracked through the still air. The Grizzly reacted with a grunt, stepping away from the RV. The bright spray misted in its direction, making it rear slightly and turn toward the cover of the trees. With heavy strides, it retreated into the dense brush, breaking branches as it vanished into the wild. The officers held their positions for several minutes, watching the undergrowth for any sign of a return before moving toward the damaged vehicle. Rescue crews arrived moments later, working to help the family climb out through the side door now facing upward. Hands reached down to guide each person to the road, their feet crunching on scattered glass and debris. Linda's arm was scraped and sore. John's shoulder bore a deep bruise, and both children had cuts along their arms and faces from flying shards. Despite the injuries, none were in critical condition. Medical staff cleaned wounds, wrapped bandages, and checked for signs of shock before loading the family into an ambulance for further care. The RV sat on its side like a broken shell, one window cracked wide open, cupboards hanging loose, and personal belongings scattered across the road. Fuel and water leaked in thin streams toward the ditch, and the scent of crushed food drifted into the air. Officers marked the spot, noting the deep claw marks on the metal and the wide paw prints leading into the forest. Later that day, wildlife trackers followed the bear's trail deep into the mountains, confirming it had moved far from the road. Officials stressed the importance of keeping travel speeds low in such areas and remaining alert for sudden movement near dense vegetation. The Williams family spent the night in a small lodge in a nearby town, their bodies sore from the violent roll and their thoughts heavy with what could have happened. By the next morning, the damaged RV had been towed away, leaving only scraped pavement and broken glass as signs of the event. The story spread quickly, reminding travelers that even the safety of a large vehicle could be shattered in seconds by the wild strength of a determined predator. For the family, the echo of that roar and the sight of the bear's shadow passing outside the window would remain a memory carried far beyond Montana's winding roads. On July 20th, 2005, along the jagged coastline of British Columbia, where the conifers crowd the bluffs and the sea moves slowly and heavily beneath an overcast sky, Ellis walked alone, just as he had most evenings since retiring from the shop floor. At 71, with one stiff knee and a shoulder that ached when the rain rolled in, he had traded in his toolbox for quiet afternoons and the rhythm of waves against stone. The fishing camp, little more than a loose scattering of cabins and smoke-tanged tents, sat nestled among the spruce behind him. But he had wandered out with the falling light to walk the tide line, something he had done for years, mostly in silence, mostly without being missed. The air that evening carried the bite of distant salt, cold enough to flush the skin, but not enough to drive a man indoors. Ellis moved at his own pace, scanning the rocks and driftwood piles for something unusual, something weathered just right or shaped by the tide into something worth carving. He had taken up whittling in retirement, not out of boredom, but because shaping something slow and deliberate with his own hands made him feel in some small way like he was still building something, still making something of use in a world that had long since stopped demanding his labor. As he moved across the uneven stones, the tide low and patient beside him, he found himself stepping closer to a thicket where the forest reached nearly to the water's edge. There, the sand narrowed into a wedge of wet shale and seaweed, and the trees leaned forward like watchers, their trunks thick and moist with moss, branches heavy with fog-dampened needles. He crouched briefly, brushing his fingers along a twisted branch caught between two stones, then straightened slowly, knees popping, and turned to scan the shoreline once more. That was when he heard it. A sudden rush of motion, the sharp crack of brush being parted in a panic, and then, without warning or buildup, a large black bear burst from the tree line at full speed, its body low and wide, muscles flexing beneath thick fur still wet from whatever undergrowth it had shoved through. It was not charging in aggression, nor aiming with intent, but simply running, startled perhaps by some scent or distant sound. And Ellis, caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment, was directly in its path. The collision happened too fast for thought. The full weight of the bear slammed into him with the force of something neither violent nor gentle, just absolute. A sudden presence that bore him backward onto the rocks. His shoulder struck first, dislocating instantly with a sickening pop, and then the rest of his body followed, folding hard against the cold stone. The bear, just as disoriented as he was, stumbled briefly. In the chaos of movement, one of its claws raked across his left hip, a shallow but tearing slice that opened flesh and fabric alike, before the animal sprang past him and disappeared back into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the echo of its breathing and the scent of fur and earth. Ellis lay flat against the shale, stunned and breathless, the impact ringing through his ribs and shoulder, while blood soaked steadily into the fabric of his pants. The air was colder now. The light had dimmed further, the dusk moving quickly into something closer to night. And the tide, unnoticed before, had begun its slow, deliberate rise toward his feet. He blinked at the sky, unable to fully process what had just happened, only dimly aware of the pain swelling in waves along his hip and across the arm he could no longer move. And yet, he knew with startling clarity that no one was coming for him. The others were back at camp, busy with fish and fire and stories that came easier with distance from the water's edge. No one had heard anything. No one had seen the bear. If he stayed where he was, the tide would come. The cold would seep deeper into his bones, and whatever had spared him so narrowly might not spare him again. So he moved. With his right arm dragging his weight and his legs trailing stiffly behind him, Ellis began to crawl along the uneven shoreline, his teeth clenched so tightly that his jaw ached with every inch gained. The pain was sharp and immediate with each movement, his hip sending spikes of agony up through his side, his shoulder useless, twisted out of place. but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The cold was deepening, and the beach ahead of him looked longer than he remembered. He passed pools of tidewater reflecting the first faint glimmer of stars. He slid over slick stones and sharp shells, through patches of seaweed and broken driftwood. He moved without speaking, without crying out, without anything but the sound of his breath and the dull slap of blood against fabric. The half-mile back to camp stretched into something endless, every inch hard-won, every pause a battle between pain and instinct. When he reached the edge of camp, lantern light flickering weakly between the trees, he was barely able to lift his head. The world swam around him in waves of gray and black. His mouth was dry. His limbs were shaking. When one of the younger men spotted him crawling from the brush, blood-streaked and silent, dragging himself on one arm like something that had clawed its way up from the sea, they didn't know what to say. He didn't offer them a story. Not right away. There had been no roar, no dramatic mauling, no prolonged fight or savagery. Just a single moment. One fraction of a second where instinct met instinct and the weight of wildness touched him. Not with hatred, but with the indifferent force of something that simply was. They didn't believe him at first. It sounded too quiet, too subtle. But the torn jacket, the claw marks, the swelling around his shoulder, and the blood still fresh on the rocks told the rest of the story. Later, no one blamed the bear. They understood, as Ellis did, that what had happened wasn't an attack. It wasn't malicious. It was motion and collision, surprise and reaction, the unavoidable cost of sharing space with creatures that live not by intention, but by immediacy. He healed slowly. The shoulder was reset, the hip stitched and dressed, but the wound that stayed wasn't physical. Afterward, when he returned to the tide line weeks later, he walked the beach with his eyes on the tree line, his ears tuned not to the waves or the gulls overhead, but to the sound beneath those things, the breath beneath the birdsong, the possibility of movement in the silence. Because what stayed with him wasn't fear. It was awareness. It was knowing that the wild didn't roar to announce itself. It didn't always strike with rage or hate. Sometimes it simply moved through you, fast and without warning, and then disappeared again, leaving behind nothing but pain, memory, and the sense that something vast and unknowable had passed inches from taking you, and simply chose not to. On March 3rd, 2017, the icy horizon near Greenland's edge glowed with soft morning light, the kind that made every snowflake glisten. Mia, an experienced wildlife photographer in her early 30s, had traveled from her home in Norway to document the Arctic's most elusive creatures. Years of work in cold, remote places had made her patient and precise. She had learned to remain still for hours in freezing temperatures, waiting for the perfect moment when an animal's movement told a story no words could. This trip had been planned for months, timed to coincide with the late winter season when polar bears could often be spotted near the ice edge hunting for seals. Mia's small inflatable boat drifted gently in the calm water, each paddle stroke barely disturbing the glassy surface. Layers of insulated clothing wrapped around her, and a thick hat shielded her ears from the cutting wind. Her camera hung from a strap across her chest, its lens pointed toward a distant cluster of ice floes. In her pack, she carried emergency gear, flares, and a satellite phone, knowing how quickly the Arctic could change from serene to dangerous. The early hours had been quiet, filled only with the sound of the boat's gentle creak and the distant call of seabirds. Then a movement on a nearby floe caught her eye. A small polar bear cub, its fur bright against the white ice, stood alone, looking toward her with unblinking curiosity. The gap of water between them was narrow, the ice shifting gently with the current. The cub's ears twitched as it tilted its head, then it stepped forward. Without hesitation, it slid into the frigid water, paddling with surprising speed toward the boat. Mia stayed still, her gloved hands resting lightly on the paddle. The cub's small head broke the surface again and again until it reached the side of the inflatable. With a quick heave of its front paws, it clambered aboard, its wet fur dripping onto the rubber floor. The animal's weight made the boat dip slightly to one side, and Mia shifted her balance to stay steady. The cub's movements were clumsy, but playful, its paws pressing into the boat's surface. Then came the faint sound, an air hiss, quiet but unmistakable. The cub's sharp claws had punctured the side of the inflatable, creating a slow leak. Mia's gaze flicked to the spot where the air was escaping, a small bubble forming in the smooth rubber. Her heart rate quickened, but she kept her body calm, knowing any sudden motion might startle the animal. From the corner of her vision, another shape emerged on the water, larger, faster, and moving with purpose. The mother bear was closing in. Her head was low, eyes locked on the boat, and each powerful stroke brought her closer. The cub turned toward the sound of the splashes, and the stillness in the air vanished as the mother's deep growl rolled across the water. The cub froze at the sound, its small frame pressed close to the boat's floor. The larger figure moved swiftly through the icy water, each surge leaving a ripple that spread wide across the calm surface. The mother's massive shoulders broke the waves, sending drops flying into the air. Her breath came in sharp bursts, steam rising from her muzzle in the cold morning light. The distance between her and the inflatable shrank with alarming speed, the water churning in her wake. Mia's eyes stayed on the advancing shape, her body tense but steady. She reached for the flare gun secured to her side, fingers working through the thick gloves. The cub shifted, stepping closer to the boat's edge, its wet fur brushing against her leg. A low growl rolled over the water, deeper now, carrying urgency and warning. The mother bear's head lifted slightly, eyes locked on both the cub and the strange shape of the inflatable. The flare gun came free, its cold weight resting in her hand. She raised it toward the pale sky and squeezed the trigger. A burst of light tore through the air, the flare streaking upward before exploding in a shower of bright sparks. The sharp crack echoed across the frozen expanse, startling the cub into a quick shuffle backward. The mother slowed, her strokes becoming more measured as she lifted her head higher, scanning the sky before returning her gaze to the boat. Mia fired again, the second flare sending another loud blast across the water. The mother's growl faded into heavy breaths, her eyes narrowing as she turned slightly to one side. The cub, sensing the shift, slipped back into the water and paddled toward her. They met just beyond the boat, the smaller form circling the larger in the safety of its shadow. After a long moment, the two began moving away, their pale fur blending into the drifting flows until they vanished behind a ridge of ice. The boat rocked gently in the sudden quiet, but the sound of escaping air was sharper now. The puncture had widened, the soft hiss growing with each passing second. Mia took up the paddle and began to work quickly, each stroke sending the craft forward toward the faint outline of the shoreline. The water was still and cold, its surface broken only by the movement of the boat. Every few moments she glanced over her shoulder, watching for any sign of the bears returning. The shore drew closer, jagged rocks rising from the ice-crusted edge. By the time she reached it, the boat sagged visibly, its sides folding inward with the loss of air. She dragged it partway onto the frozen ground before stepping out, her boots crunching against the snow. Her breath came in short, heavy bursts, the sting of the cold air sharp in her lungs. Later that day, she reported the incident to local wildlife officers, detailing the encounter and the location. They listened carefully, noting the behavior of the animals and the unusual curiosity of the cub. The event sparked discussions about the increasing overlap between human activity and polar bear territory, especially in changing ice conditions. In the days that followed, Mia's photographs from earlier that morning became part of her record of the Arctic's shifting balance. Yet the memory of the mother's swift approach and the sound of the boat giving way stayed vivid. The encounter had ended without injury, but the weight of what could have happened lingered like the chill that never left the air. The morning of February 10th, 2025, low clouds pressed against the coastline as the tide began to slip away from the rocky shore. The beach at Breaker Point stretched wide and gray, scattered with seaweed and tangled driftwood, all silvery and damp from the morning mist. Two hunters, Daniel, age 45, and Luca, age 40, stood near the water's edge, backs aching from the weight of their catch. They had been out since first light, fighting the cold surf with thick gloves and rubber waders, their arms burning as they hauled a 70-pound halibut up the sand. Both men were experienced and quiet by nature, shaped by years of working the edges of wild Alaska. Daniel had once been a guide before leaving that life behind for the stillness of coastal hunting. Luca, his brother-in-law, had come from Juneau, eager for a break from city noise and paperwork. Together, they worked in rhythm, saying little, moving with the care of men who understood what lived just beyond the trees and tides. As they dropped the halibut beside a bleached log, Daniel turned to rinse his gloves in a shallow pool. Luca leaned forward, hands on his knees, panting from exertion but grinning at the catch. The wind shifted faintly. A gull cried overhead. And then, from behind a twisted pile of driftwood, the Kodiak Bear moved. It was enormous, copper-coated, and utterly silent. The bulk of it emerged like a shadow peeled off the logs, moving on thick limbs that barely rustled the sand. Luca didn't have time to turn. One moment he stood, hands on hips. The next he was struck with such force that his body lifted off the ground and tumbled through the air, landing hard in a patch of wet sand 10 feet away. His scream was short, more breath than voice, and then he was on his back, arms twisted beneath him, mouth open in shock. Daniel spun too late. The bear was already towering over Luca, its massive forelegs stomping down, pinning his ribs to the beach. There was no sound from the animal, no growl, no roar, no warning at all. Just the heavy exhale of its breath and the dull, wet sound of bones giving way beneath the weight of its paws. Its claws swept once across Luca's upper chest and shoulder, tearing through jacket and skin with equal ease. Blood sprayed sideways, mixing with the foam at the water's edge. Luca gasped and twisted, somehow conscious, his eyes wide and wild. Daniel didn't move. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to shout, to fire his sidearm. But his limbs were frozen, heart slamming in his chest like it was trying to escape. The bear didn't spare him a glance. It stepped back from Luca, turned to the halibut lying in the sand, and bit down with powerful jaws. The fish folded in half with a sickening crunch. Then, without a single glance back, the bear carried it off into the mist, vanishing toward the tree line like a ghost made of muscle and hunger. Only when the silence returned did Daniel run to Luca's side. The sand was red beneath him. Luca's breathing came in harsh, wet pulls, and one arm hung uselessly at his side, the shoulder split wide open. His ribs shifted visibly beneath torn fabric. But he was alive. Daniel pressed his jacket into the wounds, blood soaking through almost instantly. His voice shook as he activated the emergency beacon clipped to his belt, the satellite signal pinging far beyond the fog. He spoke into the radio, barely registering what he said, watching Luca's face for signs of slipping away. Minutes felt like hours. It took 40 minutes for the medevac to arrive, the thumping blades breaking through the still air like thunder. Luca had stopped talking by then, his head lolling but eyes still open, blinking slowly. They lifted him on a stretcher, bandaged him mid-air, and disappeared back into the sky. Daniel remained on the beach, shaking, breathing unevenly. The halibut's blood trailed away toward the sea, mixing with Luca's in a tide pool that shimmered red against the rocks. The bear hadn't come to fight. It hadn't shown rage or fear. It had come for food, and Luca had simply been in the way. Later in the hospital, Luca would recover with rods in his ribs and long scars down his chest. His arm regained motion after weeks of therapy, though he couldn't lift it above shoulder height. But the damage that haunted him wasn't physical. He would tell Daniel in low whispers between long silences that what stayed with him most wasn't the pain. It wasn't even the bear's claws or the weight crushing his lungs. It was the moment just before it struck, when everything was still, and he hadn't known death was already rushing toward him. There had been no sound, no warning, just motion and weight. Breaker Point remained quiet. The beach looked unchanged weeks later, fog still clinging to the rocks, driftwood still bleached and tangled. No one came to retrieve the leftover gear. Daniel didn't return to fish there again. He told himself the bear had only acted out of need. It was the hunger of an apex predator, not rage or vengeance. But even now, When he closed his eyes, he saw the blur of muscle behind the logs, the spray of sand, the way Luca's body crumpled like it did not weigh its own. The sea had stayed calm that day. There were no storms, no howls from the woods, no signs that something had gone wrong, just silence. And then, in that silence, something too powerful to stop had arrived, left its mark, and vanished without a sound. On March 3rd, 2025, the early fog still clung to the rolling hills of Napa Valley, wrapping the vineyards in a pale silver mist. Maria, a dedicated vintner in her early 40s, had spent most of her life working among these rows of grapevines. Her family had owned the vineyard for 3 generations, each harvest a blend of tradition, hard work, and love for the land. The sprawling fields stretched across gentle slopes, dotted with oak trees and bordered by old stone walls. At the heart of the property stood a weathered wine cellar built decades ago by her grandfather, its thick wooden door and stone frame still strong despite years of wind and rain. Maria began her mornings before sunrise, walking the rows with a small basket to inspect the ripening grapes. That day, the air was still and heavy with the sweet scent of fruit ready for harvest. Her boots crunched softly over the damp soil as she rounded a bend near the lower vines. That was when she noticed movement among the clusters of grapes. A large black bear stood in the middle of the row, its thick, dark fur glistening with dew. Its head was lowered, muzzle buried in the vines as it tore at bunch after bunch of ripe fruit. Broken stems and scattered grapes lay across the soil, the ground already littered from its feeding. Maria froze for a moment, her breath catching as the predator lifted its head. Juice dripped from its mouth, and its small, dark eyes locked on her with an intensity that made the air feel colder. She took a cautious step forward, clapping her hands and waving her arms, hoping to scare it away. Instead of retreating, the animal stiffened, shoulders rolling forward and lips curling to reveal sharp teeth. A deep growl rumbled from its chest, low and heavy. It began to advance, slow at first, then with deliberate, steady steps that closed the distance between them. Maria's pulse quickened as she backed toward the old wine cellar at the edge of the field. The fog seemed thicker now, the shapes of the vines fading behind her as she moved. The bear's pace quickened, paws pressing into the soil with a dull thud each time. When she reached the heavy wooden door, she threw her weight against it, pulling it open just wide enough to slip inside. The moment she stepped through, the bear lunged. The door slammed shut with a deep, resonating thud as its weight crashed against the outside. The thick wood shuddered under the impact, dust falling from the old beams above. A second blow came almost instantly, followed by the sound of claws scraping deep grooves into the surface. The guttural roars echoed through the still morning, the sound bouncing off the cellar walls and making them tremble. Maria pressed her back against the door, every muscle tense. The pounding continued, each strike making the hinges groan. The scent of crushed grapes and the musty air of the cellar filled her lungs as the relentless attack outside showed no sign of slowing. The heavy blows came one after another, rattling the frame as if it might give way at any moment. Outside, the bear's deep breathing could be heard between strikes, a steady reminder of the strength just beyond the barrier. The air inside the cellar was cool and damp, but Maria's skin was warm with fear. She pressed harder against the wood, bracing her legs against the stone floor, feeling every vibration travel through her body. Dust drifted down from the rafters with each impact, and the scent of aged oak barrels mixed with the earthy smell of soil clinging to her boots. The predator began pacing, its claws scraping along the outer walls, leaving sharp marks in the old wood. Every so often, it returned to the door, delivering another crushing strike that made the hinges creak. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching into what felt like hours. Maria's breathing was shallow, her heartbeat loud in her ears, but she remained still, knowing any sound might renew the animal's rage. At one point, the bear's roars grew louder, reverberating through the thick walls. Its weight slammed into the door again, causing the latch to strain against the frame. Small splinters scattered across the floor inside. The sound of paws shuffling outside suggested it was circling again, searching for another way in. The cellar's single small window was far too high for the animal to reach, but its presence under that narrow opening sent a heavy, musky smell drifting inside, making the air even harder to breathe. Suddenly, the noise changed. From somewhere in the distance, The faint hum of an approaching vehicle broke through the fog. The bear's movements became restless, pacing faster, claws striking the walls in quick bursts. A sharp metallic sound rang out as the latch on the door was tested once more, but this time it was followed by heavy thuds retreating toward the vineyard. Maria stayed frozen in place, unwilling to believe it was over. Within minutes, voices and steady footsteps approached, and the door creaked open under careful hands. Wildlife officers stepped inside, their gear still damp from the mist. Outside, more personnel moved through the vines, tools in hand, long poles tipped with bright-colored canisters meant for deterring large predators. 2 officers reported seeing the bear moving toward the property's edge, its form disappearing into the trees as a tranquilizer dart struck deep. Maria emerged slowly, her muscles aching from holding position for so long. The vineyard looked different now. The vines near the cellar flattened, clusters of grapes torn away, deep paw prints pressed into the soft soil. The bear had left its mark not only on the crops, but on the heavy cellar door, where deep grooves cut through the once smooth wood. In the days that followed, neighbors visited to offer support. Discussions began about stronger fencing, motion alarms, and nighttime patrols to keep wildlife at a safe distance. The story of the intrusion spread quickly through the valley, reminding everyone that the line between cultivated land and wild territory was thinner than it seemed. For Maria, the image of the predator's shadow against the morning fog would not fade, a lasting memory of how quickly the peace of the vineyard could be broken. The rugged coast of Kodiak Island stretched under a pale morning sky, the air filled with the scent of salt water and fish carried on the wind. Lena, a seasoned wilderness guide in her mid-30s, had spent over a decade leading expeditions into this remote and unforgiving landscape. She was known for her steady judgment, her deep understanding of bear behavior, and her commitment to safety in places where one wrong move could cost a life. Raised in a small Alaskan fishing town, she had grown up surrounded by wildlife and wild weather, learning early that respect for nature was not optional here. Mark, her client for this trip, was a few years younger and carried a restless curiosity. He had traveled from the mainland to experience the raw presence of Kodiak's coastal bears. This was his first close-range wildlife excursion, and though he listened to Lena's instructions at the start, his excitement often pushed him to the edge of caution. The two had set out early to reach a remote beach known for salmon runs that drew some of the largest bears in the region. The shoreline was harsh and beautiful. Jagged rock outcrops split the surf, and dark sand stretched between pools of seawater left by the tide. Seaweed clung to stone, and the sharp cry of gulls cut through the deeper roar of the ocean. The sky was pale but clear, and the distant peaks of the island's mountains faded into mist. Along a shallow stream that cut across the sand, a massive Kodiak bear stood, its fur thick and golden brown, shoulders rippling with each movement. It pulled salmon from the water with swift, practiced strikes, the red fish flashing briefly before vanishing into the grip of its jaws. Lena kept her pace slow, maintaining a wide buffer between them and the animal. Her steps were deliberate, her eyes never leaving the bear's movements. Mark, however, drifted closer, drawn forward by the sight of the predator in its element. He moved ahead along the damp sand, the crunch beneath his boots nearly lost under the crashing surf. The bear's head suddenly lifted, its small, dark eyes fixed on the figure approaching. The space between them, once safe, shrank in an instant. Lena's gut tightened as she recognized the shift in the bear's posture. The weight forward, the low swing of the head, the ears angling back. The charge began without warning. Sand sprayed beneath the bear's paws as it surged forward, closing the distance with frightening speed. The sound of its breathing grew louder, matching the deep thud of its footfalls. Mark froze for a heartbeat before stumbling backward, his movements jerky against the smooth, controlled force of the oncoming animal. Lena broke into a sprint, the wind tearing at her clothes, her boots sinking into wet patches of sand. The crash of the waves seemed to grow sharper around her, blending with the first raw screams that carried down the beach. The sight ahead was chaos, Mark retreating, the bear closing, and no barrier between them as the predator bore down with unrelenting power. The bear collided with Mark in a single crushing impact that drove him onto the wet sand. Its massive paws came down again and again, each blow tearing through the fabric of his jacket and the straps of his gear. The force of its weight shook the ground beneath them, the sound of claws striking stone beneath the thin layer of sand, mixing with the roar of the nearby surf. Water from the shallow stream splashed as the struggle shifted toward the edge of the flow, the current swirling red as it mixed with the tide. Lena closed the gap as fast as she could, her lungs burning from the sprint. The sight was overwhelming. Mark pinned beneath the predator, his arms jerking as he tried to shield his head. The bear's head lowered, jaws closing over his shoulder, and its neck muscles tensed as it shook violently. The sound of tearing fabric and muffled cries filled the air. Lena reached into her pack, pulling free a flare, her fingers working without hesitation despite the shaking in her hands. The first burst of light and smoke cut through the haze. The bright flash caught the animal's attention for only a moment before it pressed back down on its victim. Lena ignited another and waved it wide, moving closer to draw the predator's gaze away. The noise from the burning flare hissed sharply against the steady crash of the waves. At last, the bear shifted its focus, lifting its head toward the figure approaching, with the bright, burning light. The animal stepped back, its breaths heavy and uneven, then turned slightly toward the line of rocks at the far end of the beach. For a long second it lingered, its eyes darting between Lena and the motionless body at its feet. Then it began to move toward the boulders, muscles rolling under its thick coat, every step deliberate as it withdrew. The sound of its movement faded into the jagged shoreline, replaced by the wind and the distant cry of seabirds. Lena dropped to her knees beside Mark. The damage was severe, deep gashes along his arms and torso, and blood pooling quickly beneath him. She tore strips from a spare shirt in her pack, pressing them hard against the worst wounds. Her hands worked frantically, but his breaths were shallow and fading. The cold from the wet sand seeped upward, and the tide edged closer with each passing wave. Minutes dragged before help could reach the remote stretch of coast. When the rescue team finally arrived by boat, they found Lena still beside him, her clothes stained dark, her face set in grim focus. They worked quickly, but the extent of his injuries was beyond what could be treated on sight. The effort to save him continued, until it was clear there was nothing more to be done. Mark's body was carried to the boat with care, the sound of the motor starting breaking the stillness. Lena stayed on the shore for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the rocks where the bear had vanished. The beach felt heavier, the wind colder, as the reality of the loss settled over the scene. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly across the island and beyond. Officials reminded visitors that the coast was one of the most dangerous places to approach wildlife, especially during the salmon run. Local guides spoke quietly among themselves about the risks they faced each season, the fine balance between observation and intrusion. For Lena, the image of that morning remained fixed in her mind. The sudden shift in the bear's posture, the charge across the sand, and the moments where time seemed to stretch forever. The shoreline where it happened returned to its natural silence, but for her, it would always carry the weight of what was lost.